Within a couple of seconds, there were a number of armed security with great big airport machine guns.
An autism patient's daring escape from NHS psychiatric care pits her against some of the most powerful institutions in the state. From the multi-award-winning Sky News Storycast team, in partnership with The Independent, follow Patient 11, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to ClimateCast. I'm Tom Clarke, Sky's Science and Technology Editor, standing in for Tom Heap. And I'm currently in Westminster because I'm speaking to Chris Skidmore, former Conservative minister who resigned from government in protest over its direction on the issue of net zero. Chris Skidmore led the government's net zero review and was a vocal critic of some of the government's new rhetoric around the issue of net zero and the burden that they say it would place on the UK if we moved too quickly in decarbonising our economy. But he stayed in position right up until the government's key petroleum licensing bill, one to try and see annual licences for oil and gas in the North Sea. That for him was a red line. Chris, I'll come on to the reasons for your resignation in a second, but first of all, what was it that put you on a path to champion net zero and climate change during your time in government and in Westminster?
I think it probably was a conversion moment, if I'm honest. I've been a Member of Parliament for nearly 14 years. I started off winning a marginal seat by focusing on issues around the countryside, environmental protection, the green belt. But it wasn't sort of really until I became a minister in the department for what was like business, energy, innovation, skills base. I was the Science, Research, Innovation Minister, that I began to sort of see what I've tried to get across, that obviously climate action is not just about the environment. There are new technologies, new industries rapidly emerging, and this is an economic argument as much as anything. And then I had this chance to become Energy Secretary, partly by accident, because the previous Energy Secretary, Claire O'Neill, had to stand down for personal reasons. I was able to step up to attend Cabinet. And it was just at that moment that the UK also decided to take up the Committee on Climate Change advice to sign net zero into law. If you told me then back in 2019 that now over 90% of world GDP would be under a net zero target of some form, I simply wouldn't have believed you, the pace at which we've moved. On the one hand, I've seen net zero economically and across the rest of the world sort of was enshrined itself now in a new business model for a new economy that is rapidly advancing. But at the same time, net zero being seen as some kind of dirty word in a culture war that's somehow going to mean that everyone who believes in net zero is some kind of eco-loon. It was just simply not the case. And so there's these sort of two polar opposites. One of the just simple economic transition, the energy transition that is happening at a pace. And then on the other hand, that sort of cultural populist element that I feel also a duty to be able to fight back against, because it's simply not just the wrong thing to do. It's actually going to cost the UK investment, jobs and growth for the future.
I want to come on to ask you about what precipitated your resignation. But before I do that, what's it been like working within Conservative Party, within government at times in recent years, given the way the language has changed? I mean, I think the words in the Commons used by the current Energy Secretary about people who opposed their petroleum licensing bill were extremist climate ideologues. Do you see yourself as one of those? That kind of language, does it help?
So obviously, language is the be-all and end-all when it comes to messaging. The medium is the message in politics, and obviously if that message is delivered from the highest authority, the Prime Minister, then that's what's obviously going to get picked up by the media, and I fully accept that. But I'm also keen to recognise that the UK government is not just politicians at the top taking decisions. There are some fantastic departments, civil servants who I worked with on the Net Zero Review, I worked with as a minister. There are ambassadors across the country who are really flying the flag, demonstrating that we are a leader, both in business and industry, our NGOs, our universities, all moving forwards. Government, is many faces. Unfortunately, the public face of government, at the moment, has sort of decided to take quite a harsh tone, and I think that's regrettable. One of the reasons why I took that, long, difficult decision to resign, not just as a Conservative, but also as a Member of Parliament, to get across the essential nature of this, is here for the long term. So I think we're on not necessarily a long-term pathway away from net zero. There's just a blip at the moment that's caused by regrettable short-term decisions, political decisions, to try to sort of, create dividing lines, to politicise climate action, which should never have been the case.
A few weeks ago, you decided to resign. What was the straw that broke the camel's back? What was the thing that precipitated that decision?
I decided that I was more interested in conservation than the Conservative Party ultimately. That's what I decided that I would be focusing on. And so back in November 2022, when I was leading the Net Zero Review, I decided to not vote on fracking. And I said that I cannot vote for this, even though it was a confidence vote. And that sort of precipitated the fall of the then Prime Minister, sort of Liz Truss. And I was sort of clear then that I would take the decisions that I saw right for the country, right for our planet, rather than necessarily right for me as a politician or right for the Conservative Party or all this sort of soap opera that's sort of been going on in recent sort of months. And then I had the opportunity to publish the Net Zero Review, which I was very grateful for the Prime Minister and the government in allowing me that. And they're very grateful that they came forward in this first half of 2023 to take up about 100 of the 129 recommendations. It looked like things were going in the right direction. And then obviously we had that Ealing by-election, where then it precipitated the Prime Minister taking quite a strong stance. Actually, I think the government's been guilty of green hushing. They've actually been getting on with great things still, as I said, behind the scenes. But the voice of the country was then saying net zero is a cost, that it's a burden on people, we're going to go slower. And that I absolutely inherently disagree with. And I was very vocal and against that. I was vocal against then when the government said it was going to issue more licences. I was equally more vocal when the government said it was going to approve Rosebank, that I totally disagree with. And then I wouldn't vote on the King's speech. Also, I stood up in Parliament. I apologised to the King, saying I can't vote for your speech because of this oil and gas bill. And I knew that moment came where I was probably going to have the whip taken away from me, or I would have to resign the whip at some point. There was a crunch point sort of coming. And the second reading of this oil and gas bill, I sort of felt I either then could sit as an independent, vote against the government, as I've done on many times during the energy bill. Would that necessarily, be recognised, or it wouldn't? I sort of felt that I'd have greater impact leaving to sort of stand down to stand up, to sort of demonstrate the severity of the consequences of the UK government's decision.
What game do you think Rishi Sunak and Number 10 is playing with this shift in rhetoric around net zero? They're trying to foment a culture war. Is it to appease certain parts of the Conservative Party, or is it a genuine belief that it's going to win them some votes? Because when I've met Rishi Sunak, he seems to understand this. As you said, government behind the scenes is working pretty hard on the net zero transition, on things like heat pumps. I think they've increased the grants. We're seeing more installations than we have done under any previous government. Yet the other face is saying a completely different thing. What's the strategy, do you think?
I think it's probably going back to sort of cakeism, that somehow that you can, on the one hand, sort of try to get on with delivering the transition, and as you say, some fantastic policy initiatives where the UK is genuinely sort of world leading, and we want to promote that. But I think you've got to go all in. I genuinely sort of feel that the confusion that's now been set in, international investors are not sort of coming to the UK at the moment because it's created this sort of sense of paralysis. The messaging is what matters, and that sort of turn away from the messaging, kowtowing to a tiny vocal minority for people who represent parties that don't even have an elected representative is deeply regrettable. As I've said in the past, it's the greatest mistake of Rishi Sunak's premiership. And I mean, I'm not a psephologist, but when you look at the polling, you can see that net zero moment as something that actually began to widen the polls. It didn't close them. And the challenge, I think, has been whoever's sort of advising him on strategy has said, look at this Ealing by-election, we could maybe sort of somehow stop the decline if we can shore up our own base. But it's not the case. The country is not one single constituency that had a particular issue that was coming in 2 weeks' time. There's nothing to do with net zero anyway. Obviously, the ULEZ charge, which became sort of highly politicised in the heat of the moment. That's died down now, sort of in terms of as the saliency of that issue. But they pinned a whole national strategy and U-turn away from what was UK PLC's sort of post-Brexit sort of vision around how the UK could be a green leader and help the rest of the world decarbonise. Yes, we're 1% of emissions, but equally how we could take that opportunity to show that decarbonisation isn't going to cost jobs. There is a model of clean growth. We've decarbonised by 50% since 1990, but we've grown our economy by 70%. It can be done. And that's the challenge. Framing this stuff as a cost when it's not a cost, simply is a gift horse to those people who want to oppose net zero and climate action because they don't believe in it anyway. It's a bit like immigration. The more you talk about it as being a challenge, people will then turn around and say, well, great, but you haven't solved it, therefore I'm going to vote for another party. I just feel it's a deeply regrettable strategic error.
What economic, societal impact could the decision to shift the rhetoric on net zero have? How much damage could this play by the current government do?
Well, I think that the damage is potentially one of stasis. So, this whole challenge around the longer you stand still, the further you fall behind, that there are net zero markets, even as we're speaking now, there'll be some board meeting making an investment decision, potentially not to come to the UK and place that investment sort of elsewhere. I want that investment to come to the UK because they're unclear on where the UK is going. I'm not too different from Labour on this, actually, when it comes to saying, well, set a plan. Stick to the plan. What's your outcome and how are you going to deliver on it? Because that unlocks confidence for business to invest. So I think that's the challenge for me, is that we haven't got time to waste. It's like 70-something months or so till 2030. It'll come around pretty fast. And the longer we leave it, the greater the cost of materials, the greater the labour costs become. And we just need to get on with it. And that's the real tragedy here, is that we've just cost ourselves time and we don't have time to burn.
You mentioned Labour there. You're not tempted to go and work for them?
I said I will work for all political parties. I've said in my resignation statement that I'm now an independent, not a member of Parliament, but in terms of my own sort of viewpoints, I've moved away from party politics. I don't want to really have that tribal element. I'm committed to focusing on net zero. It's got to be all political parties that deliver net zero. So yes, I would work with Labour if they were in government. I'll work with anyone who's committed to an agenda that I see as being essential for the future.
You wouldn't represent them as a member of Parliament?
No, I've left that behind. I think, honestly, my own political philosophy isn't necessarily reflected in any one sort of political party at the moment. I've been placed in a position where I can no longer be a Conservative MP because the party's moved away from what I saw as being a core value.
The Inflation Reduction Act in America has been credited with a huge shift in their transition to a cleaner economy, one that threatens other nations in a way, including our own, in terms of competition for jobs, resources, economic opportunities. With the US election coming up, do you have concerns that that could undermine what's going on in the US, and could that have repercussions here?
So after I published Net Zero Review, I actually travelled to Washington. I gave a speech at the Atlantic Council and really tried to make this message that we could form a new green special relationship between the UK and the US. I really don't see this as an either or. And there's enough jobs to go round that would allow economic growth in the US and the UK. Now, in terms of if there's a change in government, if it goes red, obviously a lot of that investment has gone into red states. Trump, will still want to create jobs. He'll still want to have an economic message. It's like what happened with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. He railed against it, abolished it, and then just recreated it with a different name. And I think that's going to be the case with the Inflation Reduction Act might get sort of stripped back and renamed. But there's still going to be a leadership opportunity for the US that any president will want to seize if it's a good news story. And this is a really good news story.
Isn't it the sort of good news story we should be seeing here in the UK? And what do we need to get that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, this is something where, again, I've tried to shout till I'm blue in the face that this is the future. This is not just about an electoral cycle. This is a transition where we've seen transitions happen, and it's one that obviously we've got to get right. We don't want to sort of waste money and create inefficiencies, but ultimately there is a shared success that we can have in leading not just on net zero, but on this future economy. There's no future economy without a green economy. And we've got huge international opportunities for export opportunities, not just in technologies, but in the services industry, the standards, again, that we are world leading in the UK. And really, we should be championing the sectors that we could actually be exporting their opportunities to help other countries as well. So I see it as a win-win-win-win-win, for the future. And I just hope that we will see this as a transitory blip that we'll learn the lessons from looking back.
Isn't it a bit tempting, though, to be a bit Panglossian, a bit over-optimistic about the transition? Yes, there will be green jobs. Yes, there is huge opportunities, but they're not necessarily where the jobs are now. They're not necessarily where communities are at the moment. We've now got refineries like Grangemouth closing, threatening an entire community that could be gone before the big employers from offshore wind or hydrogen or carbon capture come along. It's easy to say, we can have a transition, but the reality of delivering it is much, much harder.
Yeah. There's nothing you can do. The transition's here. It's happening. So you can either help plan and support the transition, or you can just allow a free transition to happen. So it really is a case that we can't just sit back thinking that if we do nothing that somehow those jobs are going to be supported. The real challenge is providing the clarity and the certainty and the consistency, both of investment, strategic sort of outcomes that need to happen, and to support the training and the workers' future roles that will be needed. Otherwise, we'll face quite severe consequences, and no one will thank them at the ballot box for not taking this action. Sort of delay is only kicking the can down the road, and the costs of kicking the can down the road will only grow.
Do you agree Rishi Sunak was right when he started that sort of net zero reset speech, saying we need to be more honest about what it's going to be like to transition? This is going to cost families. They might get support to put in a heat pump, but we'll have to pay for that somehow, and that must be through taxation. There are people going to be put out of work, people towards the end of their careers who maybe it's too late to retrain and transition. Do you have some sympathy for the fact there is going to be a lot of opposition, a lot of upset, and a lot of pain over this?
What I would say is I totally disagreed with that line in the speech, because it tried to create a false dividing line with anyone who'd been working on the energy transition and net zero, as if they hadn't considered this already, as if somehow he'd come out of the woodwork with a brand new idea that somehow everyone else is ploughing on with net zero, and he decided that he'd be the first person to put his hand up and say, hang on a second, there's consequences to this transition. And of course, that just denigrates the massive amount of work that has been done across all sectors in recognising and repeatedly stating the cost of the transition, not least in the Net Zero Review, which was absolutely, if you read it, it just basically states on every page there are costs and consequences and pathways, but if you don't sort of set out the certainty and the long-term strategic direction, then there is a not zero pathway that is going to cost more and will cost more in terms of human capital and jobs for the future. So I think that was a real shame that somehow to castigate anyone who'd been working on the energy transition as somehow sort of naive, as you say, Panglossian sort of people who hadn't thought this through. Ultimately, though, that to go in the opposite direction, to claim that somehow it's a cost that can't be met, is to deny the future. I saw this as a member of Parliament in the back in the 2010s, where we hadn't taken necessary steps on flooding, and then it came back to haunt us. Sort of hadn't taken necessary steps on certain renewable and nuclear projects. It came back to haunt us. All decisions that get sort of 10 years down the line. And I'm pretty sure 10 years down the line we will look at this year as a moment of deep regret, where the UK could have led, could have continued to push forwards, yet we decided to press the pause button for a year while we waited for a general election. Just a little anecdote I read about somewhere. You met David Attenborough. You asked him about net zero and climate change. What did he say to you? Yes, that's right. It was in Portcullis House in Westminster. I was a science minister, so this was before I sort of was energy minister and did net zero, and I was responsible for the British Antarctic survey as part of my ministerial portfolio. It was to sort of celebrate the work of the British Antarctic survey that this event happened. I had this opportunity I said, could I meet David Attenborough? Sort of fanboy moment. I think he got sort of pulled away from the event to have a quick chat with me. I'm not sure whether he wanted to chat, sort of Conservative minister at the point, but I sort of said to him, I just wanted to just ask your opinion about what you felt sort of I should focus on as a minister, given that I might not have much time. Is there any particular areas of focus that you think this needs to? And he just looked at me and said, just get on with it. It's like, you haven't got any time. It's just like, just get on. I almost got quite frustrated and angry that I'd asked a stupid question, but sort of, I sort of felt then that, that was a sort of, for me, a moment I remember looking back, slightly sheepishly embarrassed about sort of, if you're a minister, you haven't actually got much time politically as well as environmentally, and just getting on with it is exactly what, I hope to do now.
Chris Skidmore, thanks very much for joining us. That's all for this week's ClimateCast, produced by Emma Ray Woodhouse. Tom Heap will be back next week.